there's a little bit of disconnect between the time on all the computers from all the presenters, so I'm going to play a little short video for you that's intended to inject a little humor into what we're doing, and then we're going to bring Nate on, and then we're going to do this excellent presentation. So let me start this. Why you should always pay sales or use tax on the purchase of an aircraft or a vessel. Let's get started. Number one reason, you're a politician and you'd get recalled if you were discovered to not be paying your fair share. Two, you're a private citizen and you believe politicians can do a better job spending the money than you can. Three, the tax is nothing but petty cash to you, and you don't want to do the extra paperwork required to legally avoid the tax. Four, your corporation is doing well, and you don't want to be attacked by politicians for being a corporate jet owner. Five, you're timid and can't face a tax auditor. That's my job. Let me do it. Six, your wife or girlfriend will nag you for taking a risk. I have a couple of questions for you. Where was she when you took the risk that created the company that created the wealth so you could buy the vessel or the aircraft? If she was complaining about risk then, you've already proved to her that risk is worth it. Seven, you got such a good deal on your aircraft or vessel, you feel like you should share something with the government. I never feel that way. Why do you? 8. Although the Supreme Court of the United States of America has affirmed your right to legally avoid tax, you still think it's illegal. 9. The last time you got audited, you met a great-looking woman that worked for the tax agency, and you want to see her again. Sure, all of these are kind of in jest, but if you don't like any of them, you don't want to use any of these reasons, and you want to legally avoid the tax on an aircraft or a vessel purchase, call me first before you buy it. I'm Tom Alston, 916-691-9192, extension 108. The call's free. Thanks for listening. Good morning. We are, I want to introduce to you Nate Pietila. He is in the upper right-hand corner there of your video. It may not look the same on yours, but this is Tom Alston. You just saw me giving you a little advice about always paying tax. And here we go with Nate's presentation on how to do an aircraft closing. Good morning, Nate.
Morning, Tom, for having me. Welcome to you folks who are joining us on this webinar today. We've done this once before, so we're still working out some of the bugs, but we're all set and running, and we've got a presentation here that I've presented with Tom many times before, part of a longer presentation, but I think this is the most important one for purposes of properly doing an aircraft closing. How, when you take possession and delivery, pay for and purchase the aircraft, how should you do it properly? So that's what we're going to talk about today. The first thing I'm going to talk about is kind of an overview of the game that we have to play when we're advising clients in aviation matters. We are Aero Law Group. We are aviation attorneys. We just practice in aviation transactions. And the way we describe our practice to clients a lot of times is that it's kind of a big game of whack-a-mole. And you can see the slide here. There's all kinds of different issues, moles, if you will, that pop up during an aircraft transaction. And our job is to help clients through those issues and figure out which ones we can whack down. But some of them, unfortunately, are going to live in our yard, and we're going to have to figure out a way to coexist with them. You can't solve every problem necessarily. So you can see there's about a dozen different areas that we deal with here. The first one, that Tom talks about is that top center mole, state and sales use tax. These are items of personal property. An aircraft is a piece of personal property, just like any other thing that you would buy. And so it's subject to sales tax in California or another state where you might happen to be. So that's our closing process today will be focused on that mole up there, if you will. We also have the FAA mole. When you're operating a business aircraft, you have to make sure your structure complies with all FAA regulations, whether you're chartering it out or whether you're operating it privately. The FAA issues do come into play. We also deal with a number of income tax issues. So there's, I think, it's like 1, 2, 3 different moles, 4 different moles, 5 different moles there related to income tax. One is, the bottom left corner, if you're using the aircraft in business, that mole is, can I deduct the aircraft in my business? That's kind of the threshold question. Other moles we deal with are if I'm leasing or chartering my aircraft out, is that a passive activity? Do the tax rules prevent me from deducting the aircraft for that in that circumstance? So that's the mole kind of in the middle to the right there. The top right and the bottom right moles are related to personal use of the aircraft. If I'm using a business aircraft for personal use, there are some rules on personal use and entertainment use disallowance that are kind of complicated, and you have to take a look at. And the top left of the, it's not a mole, it's an airplane in this situation, kind of flying over the top of this are 1031 exchanges that we see clients do in connection with their business aircraft. We also run into IRS federal excise tax and SEC disclosure issues for public companies, and also state property tax. So there's a lot of different things that we deal with in connection with the purchase and structuring of the ownership of a business aircraft. So that's a little bit of a flip. So we're going to talk about a closing, and this is kind of how you get off on the right foot when you're acquiring an aircraft. To do a proper closing, and by closing means you signed a purchase agreement and then you've done a pre-purchase inspection, but now it's time to actually close the transaction, to actually pay for the aircraft, take title of the aircraft, file your documents at the FAA, and take physical possession of the aircraft as well. So next slide, please. So this it's not just a formality. We try to treat our closings very professionally and try to make things happen simultaneously all at the same time. We have 4 things happen at the same time, or that's all. One is that we have physical possession of the aircraft, change hands, be physically delivered from buyer to seller at a delivery location. We have title of the aircraft transferred from the seller to the buyer, or the seller to the buyer. You might think that possession and title are the same thing, but they're not. You could have title transfer, but not yet have physical possession transfer. So they're separate concepts. The third one there is actually paying for the aircraft. The money goes from the buyer's account to the seller's bank account. And number 4, registration of the aircraft, filing your registration documents at the FAA. So as you're listening to this presentation, that's the goal that we're trying to do. We're trying to make all 4 of these things happen at the same time, and to appropriately document them so that there's no question about that all these things happened and what time it was when it happened. Next slide, please. So we document these 4 things happening through a number of different closing documents. We talk about documents that are filed with the FAA. We have a warranty bill of sale and aircraft delivery receipt. Those are documents that are signed and notarized at the delivery location. I'll talk in detail more about those in a second. We have a receipt for funds from the seller that the seller confirms that they've received the payment of the purchase price for the aircraft. We have an assignment of any existing warranties with respect to the aircraft from the seller to the buyer, and we have a statement of tax exemption, which is important for California exemption purposes. So with regard to the FAA documents, if you've been involved with a aircraft transaction before, you probably have seen these documents before. There's an FAA bill of sale form and an FAA registration application. The FAA registry is an owner registry. So every owner of the aircraft has to register their aircraft with the FAA if they want to fly it. That's the nature of the FAA registry. So every owner of the aircraft has to register the aircraft with the FAA, and you also have to register the bill of sale showing the chain of title from one owner to the other. Those forms are both available on the FAA website now. The registration application form didn't used to be, but it is now. And you can download those forms and complete those forms, print them out and complete them, but they do have to be physically filed with original ink signatures in Oklahoma City. So those are those documents. Excuse me, the next document we have is the warranty bill of sale. And sometimes people get confused by the word warranty in this transaction, in this context, because it's not really a warranty relating to the physical condition of the aircraft. If you're purchasing a used aircraft, typically those sales are done on an as-is, where-is basis, and the seller doesn't warrant, promise anything about the physical condition of the aircraft. What this warranty bill of sale only has to do with is warranting good title to the aircraft, and that the seller is agreeing to defend title to the aircraft forever and ever. Amen. It's a very important promise from the seller to the buyer. In fact, it's the only promise that the seller is making to the buyer that survives closing, that survives payment of the purchase price. So it's the most important document in the deal for the buyer. It's the only thing that you're getting for your money as a buyer of an aircraft. One thing that we worry about for our clients very often is whether the seller has the assets and the ability to stand up and to guarantee that good title to the aircraft is being passed to the buyer. Sometimes we see sole purpose companies own aircraft that really don't have any assets other than the aircraft, or even if they own the aircraft, they have a very large loan to a bank, and so they might not have any unencumbered assets. So we question in those situations whether the selling entity can really stand up for the warranty bill of sale, especially with those sole purpose companies. We also worry about what would be the real estate equivalent of a quitclaim deed, where you're buying the aircraft from a bank's inventory or from the repo man or from a leasing company out of its inventory. Oftentimes they'll give you a bill of sale that doesn't promise to defend you against any claims against the title arising prior to closing. They just say, well, I'm not making any claim. I'm not making any claim against this aircraft anymore. I'm quitting my claim against the aircraft, and so I'm giving you a quit claim deed. So that's something you want to watch out too. That can create some title risk for you as well. So what we do with this warranty bill of sale document, sometimes people have purchase agreements that provide for warranty bills of sale in addition to the FAA bill of sale, but sometimes they say we'll have it go through the escrow agent, which is typically in Oklahoma City. What we do in our closings is we have the warranty bill of sale signed and notarized and physically delivered at the delivery location with the aircraft. So we do our practice a little bit differently, but when you do that, have it signed and notarized at the delivery location, it's yet another piece of evidence that you have, another document that you have that shows where title to this aircraft transferred. It transferred at the delivery location in the state that's a good closing state for sales tax reasons. The next document that we have signed and also notarized for this one in the delivery location is the aircraft delivery receipt. This is the most important document that the seller receives from the buyer at closing. And what it does is it's a very simple one-page document. It is a certification from the buyer that the aircraft was received from the seller at this time, on this date, and in this location. So it confirms the closing location, and it's got a stamp from the notary that's licensed in that state. Again, this is another document that will prove that the aircraft is in that particular location on that particular date when the close occurred. The other thing that in the case of a used transaction, a used aircraft purchase, it also contains a certification most times that the aircraft is in correct condition for delivery and that the aircraft is being received on an as-is, where-is basis. There's no promises from the seller regarding the physical condition of the aircraft and the buyers agreeing to that. This is another important document that we do in connection with the transaction. The next document we do is the receipt for funds. We often don't have this signed at the delivery location, but sometimes we do. Basically, it's a document that the seller signs, and either signs at the delivery location or puts an undated copy, signed copy in escrow, which is then dated by the escrow agent. This document is just basically a receipt from the seller saying, I received payment for the funds for this aircraft. So it's an important document for the buyer because it confirms how much you paid for the aircraft. It's got the dollar, the purchase price for the aircraft on the document. And so when somebody asks, how much did you pay for the airplane? You can just give him this one-page document, and it's signed by the seller, not by you. So it's a business record. It's got good evidentiary value, and you don't have to give the whole purchase agreement. You can just give this one-page piece of paper which shows how much you paid for the aircraft. Relating to this, when we do our closings, we always use an escrow agent to handle the purchase price and receive the purchase price from the buyer and to remit the purchase price to the seller. They hold the purchase price in escrow for both parties. And so when you do that, it's much easier to make sure that you have the funds transferred from the buyer to the seller on the closing date at the right time. The escrow agent is filing documents with the FAA in Oklahoma City, and they're also handling the funds. Because they're handling everything as an escrow agent, they can make sure that everything happens all at the same time. So the buyer deposits the purchase price in escrow before closing, and before closing, those are the buyer's funds. The escrow agent might possess the funds, but they possess them on behalf of the buyer, and they're literally the buyer's money. When the closing occurs, those funds, even though they're held by the escrow agent, they automatically become the property of the seller, and then the escrow agent wires them out to the seller. So in that circumstance, you don't have to worry about a wire not going through from the buyer to the seller or anything like that. You have an escrow agent in possession of the dollars that represent the purchase price, and it's just like a real estate closing. It should be seamless. The escrow agent has the money, takes in the purchase price, and distributes it to the right party. So that's another thing we like to make sure is done, how the funds are handled in connection with a good closing. Another document we do is called the assignment of warranties document. Even for used aircraft, there may be outstanding warranties out there. There may be engine programs or airframe maintenance or parts programs out there that need to be assigned from the seller to the buyer. There are some aircraft that have 20-year warranties on the airframe, against corrosion and structural failure, that kind of thing. So you might think, hey, we're dealing with a used aircraft. There may not be any warranties out there, but there really might. There might be some long-lived manufacturer warranties. There might be third-party hourly maintenance programs. But the other thing you might think about is, if there was recent maintenance done on the aircraft, or if there was maintenance done in connection with the pre-purchase inspection, those maintenance events, the work done in those maintenance events might be subject to a warranty. It may be a shorter warranty, like 6 months or a year, but the benefits of those warranties should pass from the seller to the buyer as well. So this is an important document for the buyer, whereby the seller assigns any of these warranties that may be outstanding to the buyer. And if the buyer wants to make a claim under a warranty, if something goes wrong with the aircraft after closing, all they have to do is show the warranty provider this assignment document, and that settles the issue. They don't have to send a 20-page purchase agreement to the warranty provider proving that they own the warranties. So this is another important document. Getting a little bit back towards why we do a closing this way, it's one of the main reasons is for sales tax and making sure that you can prove where the aircraft was when the transaction closed, because that's important for sales tax purposes. This statement of exemption form is very important in California because in order to qualify for one of the exemptions, the interstate commerce exemption, you have to close your transaction outside of the state of California. And the statement of exemption document is signed both by the seller and the buyer in the delivery location, and both those signatures are notarized in the delivery location. So this is yet another document that proves where the aircraft was at delivery, and it also meets the requirements of the Board of Equalization for showing that for the interstate commerce exemption, that the closing occurred, the purchase occurred while the aircraft was outside of California. There are some other states, if you're trying to qualify for a resale exemption or something else in another state, or a flyaway exemption, there may be a different form that you have to do in addition to the California form to qualify for that flyaway or resale exemption in that other state. So again, this is another very important form for closing. And again, the goal is to make sure that all of the 4 indicia of ownership of aircraft all happen at the same time, and that you can prove them through appropriate documents. So again, we have possession, title, payment, and registration, all 4 of those things trying to happen at the same time, and we prove that those things happen all at the same time by the execution of these documents. We have, for possession, we have the aircraft delivery receipt signed and notarized by the seller at the delivery location. For title, we have the seller sign and notarize the warranty bill of sale at the delivery location. To confirm payment of the aircraft, we have a receipt for funds signed and dated by the seller on the closing date. Also useful could be an escrow closing statement from the escrow company that's dated of the right day on the closing date. That's also helpful. And for registration, we have, using an escrow agent to file documents, we get file stamped copies of the FAA bill of sale and the registration application that show that the registration changed on that date as well. So these are how we prove those 4 indicia of ownership. We've been doing this a long time at Aero Law Group among our attorneys. We've been involved in thousands of aircraft closings, not only just when we were attorneys, but some of our attorneys worked at Boeing in their delivery center over the years. So we've literally done thousands of aircraft closings with the FAA. And we've learned a few things over the years when it comes to doing a good closing. Probably the most important thing that we advise clients on is to make sure that you use an escrow agent that's in Oklahoma City. The FAA Civil Aircraft Registry is in Oklahoma City, and all the law firms and escrow companies are based in Oklahoma City, so they can literally physically walk up to the FAA window and file your documents. They also have, bank accounts with local banks, branches in Oklahoma City that they can accept and send out wire transfers from. So we always use escrow agents in Oklahoma City to handle our FAA documents, to handle money, and they also do title searches to make sure that you've got no adverse liens or claims against your airframe or engines. Sometimes we see people, in closings, they mail registration applications or bills of sale into the FAA, but things can and do get lost in the mail. We always use the escrow agent to walk it up to the FAA window to close. We don't give FAA documents to the other side, an adverse party, and rely on them to file it with the FAA because they forget, or there turns out to be a dispute and then they decide not to do what they're supposed to do. We actually had a lawyer on the other side of the deal one time say I've got a fiduciary duty to my client not to file any document with the FAA that you give me. He thought it was his fiduciary duty to protect his client not to file anything with the FAA that the other party might have given him. The other important thing that we advise clients on is to make sure the aircraft is actually in a favorable state when you do the filings at the FAA and transfer the money. You have the aircraft on the ground in good condition in a state that's favorable for sales tax reasons. We do, on the West Coast, most of our closings in Portland, Oregon, since Oregon has no sales tax on the closing. And then after following Tom's procedures, only after we close in Oregon can we come back to California after doing an interstate business flight. So West Coast Oregon is very common. East Coast, for aircraft over 6,000 pounds, we often use Connecticut. Sometimes we use South Carolina. There's a number of states that are good for closing. There are other states with flyaway exemptions, which we don't like to use very often. But the important thing is to always consult an expert, an aviation attorney that knows about sales tax in the particular state, so that you know that you're closing in a good state. You might be exempt from California, but if you're not careful, you could expose yourself to sales tax in another state where you close. Another thing we make sure we have are representatives of the buyer and the seller signing and exchanging all documents at closing at the aircraft location. Don't sign them ahead of time or sign them after the closing. Make sure you have somebody from the buyer and the seller available to sign and notarize documents on the closing date at the delivery location. Like I said, only the registration application and the FAA bill of sale get sent through closing, sent through escrow. All the other documents get signed in the delivery location. If the principal of the buyer or the seller can't be at the delivery location, use a power of attorney to appoint a pilot or a broker or an attorney, someone you trust to follow instructions to sign documents on your behalf there. And maybe this goes without saying, but we did see a case one time where somebody took the delivery documents that were signed in the delivery location home to his wife, who was a notary, and his wife notarized them there, which was obviously not good from the perspective of having a notary stamp from the state where the closing occurred. But the notary also, his wife, was exposing herself to probably criminal liability for notarizing documents for people that she didn't know were signed and didn't see their ID. So that was a really interesting experience, a hard lesson learned. So let's see, I skipped ahead here. Slide 15. And if there's any questions, along the way, please feel to type some. That's fine. I've got a couple more slides here before I'm finished, and then we can have some more questions. One other thing we do is to make sure that we do the closing on a live conference call where everybody's on the phone on a business day when the aircraft registry is open. Don't try to close on a weekend or in the middle of the night when the FAA registry is open and banks aren't open to receive or send wires. So not weekends, federal holidays, also not days when the FAA registry might be shut down due to ice storms or something like that. Make sure you close on a business day when the FAA registry is open. Fridays are typically not great days to close because if something goes wrong, then people might be stuck over the weekend with the aircraft waiting for the FAA to open again on Monday. Tuesday through Thursday is kind of the prime time for closing it to allow for things that might happen. Make sure everybody is on the closing call at the same time. Buyer, seller, banks, lenders, attorneys, especially folks that are authorized to release funds and documents for filing with the FAA. That's very important. Use the FAA filing time as the closing time. The escrow agent will walk the documents up to be filed with the FAA, and the FAA will put a stamp on the documents that shows the very minute that they were filed at the window, and use that time consistently across all your documents, the delivery receipt and the warranty bill of sale and everything. Use that time, the FAA filing time, across all the documents. Another thing, don't send your only copy of the signed documents home on the aircraft, because aircrafts can have incidents, paperwork can get lost. Make sure you scan or fax the closing documents signed at the delivery location to somebody before the aircraft departs, so that somebody can review them to make sure they look okay, and so that if something goes wrong and the documents are misplaced, you're not just left with nothing. This is kind of another lesson that we've seen. This wasn't us, but we saw, when somebody didn't do a closing very well, and especially on an export of an aircraft, where something really ended up embarrassing the seller of the aircraft. So this is a picture from the cover of Newsweek magazine in 2005, 2006, somewhere in there. And you can see that there's an N number on the tail, which means it was a U.S. registered aircraft. It says 247 Uniform Sierra. That's actually the tail number for a U.S. Airways 727-200 that was sold by U.S. Airways, but somehow ended up with the livery of Kurdistan Airlines. And Kurdistan is a political hot potato. It's the Kurds in Iraq, and with Turkey, Iraq and Turkey. Nobody likes the Kurds over there, but somehow somebody set an airline up, so they're not really an official airline. And they also didn't take the N number off and were flying around on this N number. And somehow this aircraft ended up in Beirut during a period of hostilities. And while Beirut burned, this aircraft was grounded. And obviously somebody didn't remove the registration number, remove the registration certificate, remove the certificate of airworthiness from the aircraft, and nobody did a proper closing. It might have been deregistered at the FAA, but people skipped a few steps, and this ended up to be somewhat embarrassing for U.S. Airways. I want to update you on how the FAA is now accepting digital signatures on certain documents. So for FAA bills of sale, registration applications, leases, security agreements, anything that might get filed with the FAA registry, the FAA will now accept documents that are printed out. They still have to be printed out documents, but if they have an apparent digital signature on the bottom, they will accept them for filing with the FAA. So this doesn't mean that the FAA will accept, copies, faxes, or PDFs of documents that are signed in ink. The old rule was that you had to sign every document in blue ink in order for them to be accepted by the FAA. So it doesn't mean that the FAA will accept, copies of documents that are signed in ink. You still have to file physically ink-signed documents, but if you have the appropriate digital signature software, you can sign these documents electronically or digitally, and then send them to the escrow agent. The escrow agent can print them out and then file them with the FAA. So it has created some more convenience for clients doing closings. You don't have to FedEx documents to the client to be signed manually, and then the client doesn't have to FedEx them to Oklahoma City. We can do some of this by
Nate,
email
we have
now.
a question that came in from one of the people that says, how soon could I get you as an aviation training involved in a transaction?
How soon? Well, I can't go on back in time, so I can't say yesterday. But yeah, no, we've got several aviation attorneys. There's Kevin, me, John, and 3 other attorneys. So we've got 6 attorneys doing this stuff full time. So yeah, we've got capacity to help with transactions for sure. So Tom will send you my coordinates, and feel free to give us a call. So FAA digital signatures. If you're wanting to do digital signatures on FAA documents, most of the escrow agents have the special software that you need to do a digital signature. It's not regular electronic signatures like your base DocuSign account. It's actually a digital signature product that you have to do that's kind of expensive. Even we as a law firm don't have that product, so we rely on law firms and escrow companies in Oklahoma City. We send the documents to them, and then they send them out on their digital signature platform for signature.
Nate, this is a follow-up to the question. The person that asked it felt like you didn't really answer the question. They want to know how soon in the process of them thinking about an airplane should they be contacting an aviation firm and getting.
Yeah, that makes a little bit more sense. Sorry, I misunderstood that. Yeah, it really helps if you get us involved at the letter of intent stage before you send out a letter of intent when you're purchasing an aircraft, or before you sign a letter of intent if you're selling an aircraft, because there are a number of important business terms that you should include in the letter of intent before you go negotiating a purchase agreement. Because if you haven't solved those major business points and you spend all kinds of money on a purchase agreement, and then you end up where you can't get a meeting of the minds, you've kind of wasted your time. So it is important, I think, for us to get involved with at the letter of intent stage. And when you start sending out letters of intent and purchase agreements, things start moving quickly. Inspections can go pretty quickly, and but if you have financing that you have to line up, if you've got complicated structuring that you have to do, for income tax or other reasons, those can take time. So if it's kind of ready, shoot, aim, where you don't get somebody involved, to advise you on structuring and taxes and financing and all that kind of stuff, you could end up really behind the 8 ball if you've got to close tomorrow on an aircraft, and you really haven't done proper planning. So the 4 P's or whatever it is, proper planning prevents poor performance, right? So planning ahead is very important in these transactions. Did I answer the question? I think so.
Yes. Thank you.
Great. I just got one more slide on digital signatures. It might be a little tedious, but it really has created a lot of convenience for our clients, but you have to understand how it works. I said earlier that the FAA registration application is now available online. You can fill that out online. So that's very convenient. You can print it out and sign it in ink and send it to Oklahoma City for filing. That's still good. One thing that it has been more convenient is that there's no more carbon copy, registration applications. Those are gone. They're not printing those anymore. So the registration application actually acts as your temporary authority to operate the aircraft until the FAA finishes the registration process, in about 3 or 4 weeks. So what you do is you just put a copy of the registration application on the aircraft. So that's, rather than having to FedEx the pink slip, from one place to another all over creation, you can just put a copy of the registration application on board the aircraft. So that's good. So yeah, a lot of convenience there. So we've had this, well, let's see, about a year and a half, and it's been going pretty well. It saved a lot of steps for us, so that's good. I wanted to talk a little bit about, so anyway, we talked about this a little bit before about, how we want to have everything, um, uh, happen at one time. Have the aircraft in a particular state at a particular location, have one state's law apply, have one time and date where the transaction occurred, and have one seller, one owner of the aircraft at a time. On 1 minute the seller owns the aircraft, and the next minute the buyer owns the aircraft. And so by going through the closing process correctly, you have all those things happen, and there's no question, nobody can question who owned the aircraft at what time or where the aircraft was when it closed. So as a result, the taxing authorities can't question it. Insurance companies can't question it, so that, one insurance policy is responsible for the aircraft 1 minute, and the next insurance company is responsible for the next minute. So nobody can challenge where the closing occurred and who is responsible for the aircraft. So that's the real goal here. And sometimes these closings can get complicated, especially in cross-border transactions where the money might be coming from different countries, the aircraft might be transferring from one country's registry to another. So some of these closings can take, cross multiple time zones and take, like a day to complete. And we've been involved in some of those. So again, proper planning prevents poor performance, and it can be, exciting to do. But if you plan, it's a lot better. And again, here's a slide. I won't go into sales tax in the various states in any great detail now, since that's kind of beyond the scope of this presentation. But the point is, and Tom will tell you this, to qualify for his exemption, depending, if it's the interstate commerce exemption in California, you don't want to close in California. You want to close in another appropriate state. I mentioned Oregon as being a sales tax-free state. Montana is another sales tax-free state on the West Coast. But other than that, there's not a lot of good states that just don't have sales tax. There might be some states that have flyaway exemptions, but it might depend on whether you're a non-resident or depend on you not ever bringing the aircraft back into that state. There are some states that are tax-free on the East Coast. I mentioned Connecticut for aircraft more than 6,000 pounds. New York is now a state that has no sales tax on aircraft. We haven't seen many closings in New York, but that's been there for a couple of years as people trying to get used to that. South Carolina is another state. But you have to really be wary of state sales tax laws, because the laws might be written to benefit a particular manufacturer in the case of Georgia and Gulfstream, or Little Rock in the case of Dassault, or Kansas in the case of Cessna and Learjet. So in the case of a used transaction, especially, you really have to be wary of whether you can close in those states and not have any risk. Ohio is a state where they have lowered sales taxes on fractional aircraft purchases, but otherwise it's quite a poor state for closing a transaction. Florida and Texas are very popular states for owning and operating aircraft, because they have lots of high net worth people in those states, because they have no income tax, but they are very dependent on sales tax revenue. So you have to be very, very careful in Texas and Florida on sales tax. Again, proper planning and figuring out what a good state is for closing is very important. Advanced planning is very important in this regard. Tell you a little bit about Aero Law Group. There's our mission statement there. We just do transactional work for business aircraft owners. We've done some commercial work over the years, but primarily it's for business aircraft, and we represent just the end users of aircraft. We're not representing management companies or brokers or banks or manufacturers or management companies. We're just trying to represent the end users of aircraft, high net worth individuals and companies. So purchase and sale agreements, loan and lease agreements. We help with completion agreements for VIP aircraft, large Boeing business jet type aircraft. We help with hourly maintenance service plans. We help with FAA structuring, income taxes, state sales and use tax, SEC disclosure, back to those molds I was talking about in the first slide. And then there's some bios later on in the presentation. Tom, are you going to email this presentation to folks? I think he will.
Once I get the edited version of the video done that takes out the period of time that we lost with the internet thing, it'll be available on our website, and I'll send them a link.
Okay, great. Yeah, so there's some more bios in that slide deck about this, about our attorneys in the firm. So this is what we do full-time and exclusively aviation work. There's a disclaimer there. We're not intending to give advice here, legal advice here, because legal advice needs to know what the particular facts and circumstances are, and in a formal engagement, for that kind of thing. So this is for informational purposes only. But I do appreciate those of you who attended the webinar here and listened to the presentation. And Tom, do you have some more videos or any more items to present?
What I am going to do is I'll run one of my videos, and during that amount of time, anyone who's online, you can text us, type us a question, and we'll open that back up so that I can answer.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not going anywhere, so if you have a question, type it, and we'll answer it after the video.
Law. Whether you're a resident of California or not, if you're using an airplane or vessel inside California, within the first 12 months after purchasing it outside of California, the government can make you pay as much as 10% in taxes. You need a perfectly legal way to eliminate this tax burden. We have a 100% success rate. Aero and Marine tax professionals work in the highly specialized area of California and sales tax law. Just listen to some of what our over 1,000 successful clients have to say. Dear Aero and Marine, I am writing you this letter to express my appreciation for a job well done. I have received a letter from the California Board of Equalization informing me that I qualify for a sales tax exemption. I know there are no guarantees in life, but you are the closest thing to it. Sincerely, Dale J. Vandellen, CEO, Account Control Technology. Dear Aero and Marine, as an aircraft owner, I was aware of the specialized service provided by Aero and Marine. With some $189,000 at stake, Aero and Marine was one of my first calls. They took care of the whole process, and we gained our exemption in 6 months. Tony Gooding, President and CEO of Lake Tahoe Yacht Charters. Thank you, Aero and Marine tax professionals. The personal contact was a great benefit. Everything got done in a timely manner. Most of all, the negotiations have always shown you to do what you say you will do. The professionalism is unsurpassed. I have referred others to Aero and Marine and will continue to do so. Juan. Our professional, highly specialized focus on this one aspect of law is so successful, even leading lawyers and CPAs come to us for advice. The best time for a complete purchase tax strategy is before you.
It appears that there's no more questions, so I want to thank all of you who have been online during this webinar.